The main thing I was arguing is that many people think that neoliberalism is a movement that was pushed by business interests. And my main argument is that that wasn't the case at all. It was instead a response to a particular political moment, a particular opportunity structure that the Republican Party was able to mobilize and galvanize. I call it a political entrepreneurship argument. And the main implication of that, or the important implication of that, is that if neoliberalism were pushed by business interests, and if business interests were pushing these policies because of problems with the way that social democracy cuts into capitalist profits, that would be a much bigger problem. That would be a problem that suggests that social democracy is not compatible with capitalism. And so the whole thrust of my talk is to argue that that isn't the case. It was not business interests that were really the main part of it. It was this unusual structure, I won't go into the details, but it's this unusual structure of taxation that produces opposition to taxation in the US. And if that's the case, it's a political issue. That doesn't mean that it's any easier to resolve, but it isn't the fundamental incompatibility that sometimes people fear. So I argue that it's not going any further, at least in the one domain that I look at, which is taxation. We aren't going to see any further decreases in tax revenues. That's why the Tea Party, for example, didn't really gain a lot of traction. But I argue that we aren't going back either. We aren't going to be seeing great increases in tax revenue, and that's because of this fundamental shape of tax collection. The form of the tax structure is geared towards producing political opposition to taxes in the US. So the whole thrust of my argument is to argue that if one wants to promote policies that lessen inequality, it's the form of the tax structure that we have to be thinking about. So one of the things that I pointed to in the talk is the fact that the Republicans have actually lost the popular vote in 5 of the last 6 presidential elections. You know, they got one of the elections, even though they lost the popular vote. But in terms of just looking at how many people are voting Republican, that's not a very good record. If you look at polls for the popularity of the Tea Party, more people oppose the Tea Party now than support it. So there are these suggestions that this rhetoric of tax cuts that was so helpful to the Republicans in getting elected for several decades is kind of running its course. And I talked in the talk about some of the reasons for that. One is simply that the Republicans have been so successful at cutting taxes that there is no longer this intense opposition to taxes that there has been in previous times. So what I argue, drawing on a whole range of other scholarship, is that it has to do with how you raise your revenue. So opposition to taxes is, I argue, fundamentally about how you raise the revenue. If you raise the revenue in forms of tax collection that are extremely visible and painful to collect, you will get tax opposition. That's the argument of Harold Walensky. He was this great sociologist / political scientist who basically predicted neoliberalism in the 1970s. So that's one argument. The other is that these forms of taxes that the U.S. relies on are distort the economy more. So they punish the kinds of things that you don't want to punish. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I mean, in one way, neoliberalism clearly won, in the sense that now no one, not even the Democrats, when they have both houses of Congress, you know, in instances when they have, no one is really arguing that we should raise taxes on the middle class. You know, sometimes you get these arguments that we should raise taxes on the wealthy, but no one is really making this argument for the middle class, you know. So it's as if the opposition has completely disappeared. No one is really making that argument. So it's true that, in that sense, the Democrats are, have conceded defeat on that. On the other hand, I don't agree with this Tweedledum Tweedledee argument. You would not have gotten even, this sort of limited, attenuated form of healthcare policy. You probably wouldn't have gotten that under the current Republicans. I mean, Mitt Romney, of course, wanted a certain kind of healthcare policy like that, as he had put in place in Massachusetts. But you remember he had to run far away from this own policy. So the Republicans right now are an interesting and strange party. They have been transformed by this whole tax cut issue. Yeah, no, they haven't. I mean, if you really want my thoughts on this, my thoughts are that sociologists have tended to be a lot less ambitious than they ought to be. They aren't producing new ideas for the economy. Instead, they're studying, the discourse of how someone else talks about the economy. So this is a pet peeve of mine. So. Oh, it's extremely important. You just don't get, I guess people thought that with the age of social media, you wouldn't need these kinds of in-person gatherings, but you just don't get this kind of sustained attention to intellectual issues anywhere except if you're sitting face to face and live, if all the bodies are actually in the room. So I think these gatherings, I get so much, I get energized after doing these talks, and I get so many ideas about what I should do and what I need to think about, and I'm formulating my thoughts as I present them. So I think these things are absolutely necessary. That I'm not sure about. I mean, the one thing that I've noticed is that the ASA is much bigger and therefore more of a sort of bazaar. So whereas here there seems to be a much more of a sense of community. So that's very interesting.